I am thrilled and delighted that we have reached the portion of the afternoon in which we will hear now from our keynote speaker. It's a distinct pleasure and a real honor for me to introduce Congressman Chris Van Hollen. Representative Van Hollen was elected to Congress in 2002 in an election that received national attention. He quickly earned a reputation as an active, engaged, effective, thoughtful member of Congress, and rose quickly to become one of the youngest members of the Democratic leadership in 2008. The Washington Post named Congressman Van Hollen as one of the 10 members to watch in the last Congress. Roll Call has noted that Representative Van Hollen gets near universal respect from his colleagues for his intellectual firepower and combination of policy and political chops. Given the high esteem in which he's held, it's no surprise that in 2012 his colleagues re-elected him as the top Democrat on the House Budget Committee, and in that capacity is working to advance policies that support job creation and economic growth, that will reduce the deficit and put the country back on a path to fiscal sustainability and broadly shared prosperity. In addition to his work on the Budget Committee, and as is most relevant today, Congressman Van Hollen is a campaign finance leader without peer. As we heard earlier today, he's a leading co-sponsor with Representative David Price of the Empowering Citizens Act, which would adopt a small donor matching system for both federal elections, both for the presidential system as well as for congressional races. And it would also, I think, most importantly, put a stop to the kind of candidate-specific super PACs, the accessory of choice, that has made such a mockery of the campaign finance contribution limits. In addition to that, he has been a staunch advocate for governmental reform, particularly in the area of transparency, leading the fight to adopt the Disclose Act and shine disinfecting sunlight on political spending. And in that same vein, when the Federal Election Commission adopted the rules that we've heard about this afternoon, which have opened a giant glaring loophole in the federal disclosure laws, Representative Van Hollen sued the agency. That litigation continues, and I am very hopeful that that will restore meaningful transparency in the way that Congress intended, in the way that federal law requires, and unfortunately in a way that the FEC has dramatically undermined. In short, Congressman Van Hollen has been a tireless worker for vitally important campaign finance reforms that we have focused on here today, and I cannot think of a leader who would be better suited to close this afternoon's remarks with this keynote address. So, with no further ado, it's my great honor to present the representative of the 8th District of Maryland, Chris Van Hollen.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much for that generous introduction. It's great to be introduced by a fellow Swarthmore College alum as well. Let me thank the Brennan Center for Justice, for all the work that you do, and everybody else in this room, both in terms of your organizations as well as your interest as individuals in working to try and strengthen our democracy, to reduce the influence of big money in our politics, and trying to let a little more sunshine into the process, which will result obviously in more transparency and encouraging the public to engage more fully in the conversation that we're having today. Those should be bipartisan ideas. They should be nonpartisan ideas. The idea of transparency, the idea that everyone's voice should have equal weight in our democratic process. And it's unfortunate that many of these issues have been hijacked in ways that lose that bipartisan support. We've all been witnessing in the last 4 or 5 weeks a flurry of congressional activity around the highly inappropriate screening processes that the IRS put in place to try to determine whether organizations were engaged primarily in social welfare activity or primarily in political activity. Those screening mechanisms were obviously wrong. We need to do everything we can to make sure nobody adopts those kind of mechanisms in the future. But it's also important to look beyond what the focus of Congress is right now, which is important, to the larger issue that is really hiding behind the issue that exploded at the IRS. And that, of course, is the whole issue of people trying to spend secret money to influence political campaigns. And I think all of us recognize that that issue has been overlooked in the debate that we've had so far. And it goes to sort of the root of the issues of transparency that we're addressing today. Now, ironically, Citizens United, which was a case that, of course, opened the floodgates to a lot of corporate direct spending in political elections and campaigns, also had very strong language in it with respect to the importance of disclosure in our democracy. I mean, Justice Scalia and others had very strong words on this issue. I mean, again, 8 of the 9 justices took the position that transparency and disclosure were very important to the democratic process. Clarence Thomas had the dissenting opinion on that issue. But clearly, if you look at the spectrum of opinion among those 8 justices, this is not a left or right issue. This is an issue important to American democracy. Unfortunately, after Citizens United, we ended up getting the worst of both worlds, right? We had the floodgates open to corporate spending, including nonprofit corporations like 501c4s. But we were stuck with laws that did not have transparency. They were sort of stuck in a different campaign mindset. And so while the doors were flung open wide to corporate spending, our laws with respect to transparency are stuck in a different age. And we really need to address that issue in a big way. And in fact, that discrepancy between opening the doors to direct corporate spending, including 501c4s, and the nice language in the opinion regarding the importance of disclosure is really what you see giving rise to organizations that are kind of under one large umbrella but organize themselves into 527s and 501c4s. So, right, I mean, obvious examples, Crossroads and Crossroads GPS, or in the president's reelection campaign, whatever it was, Priorities and Priorities USA, right? So you had one campaign entity, expenditure entity set up as a 527, which requires disclosure of all the donors. But then you had another designer entity set up for people who did not want to have their identities disclosed. In fact, a lot of the 501c4s advertised themselves as the place to come if you wanted to contribute lots of money to try and influence an election without having to tell voters who you are. And that's why you have those kind of entities with dual kind of personalities, if you will. And so what do we do about this? Well, there's sort of the short term, the medium term, and the longer term. In the short term, with regard to 501c4s, it's important that the law be applied uniformly. In other words, it was obviously wrong for the IRS to go out and target groups based on keywords like Tea Party. What should be done is the law should be applied, and this is, again, I mean, in the immediate term, in a uniform manner. But it's also important to understand that the current law, in my view, puts the IRS in an impossible situation in many ways, because you've got IRS, an agency that deals with tax law, having to make 2 determinations in the case of 501c4s, right? First, they have to determine whether any particular activity is political. They have to make that decision and have a set of rules about what constitutes political activity in these campaigns. And then they've got to look at the organization and figure out whether they're spending any more than 49% of their activity on that particular, on the political front. And that is not something I think we should be asking the IRS to do. I don't think the IRS should be in the business of trying to make those kind of determinations. They're not equipped to do it, and we saw what happened with the meltdown in the immediate case, which, even if you were well equipped, was obviously a boneheaded idea in terms of approach. So what do we do about that last piece, at least with respect to 501c4s? One thing we can do is just look at the plain language of the statute, and I imagine you probably talked about this today. The statute's very clear. It says that the 501c4 organization is reserved for entities that are engaged exclusively in social welfare activities. And it's not clear to me what part of exclusive the writers of the regulation didn't get when it came to this particular provision of law. In fact, before the current scandal broke at the IRS, I'd been working with a lot of other stakeholders in this, and we had been in the process of planning to file a lawsuit against the IRS to enforce the statute, which is very clear on its face. And in fact, the groups we'd been working with had petitioned the IRS back in 2011 to get the IRS to simply adhere to the plain meaning of the law. And the IRS obviously had not responded. So we have now exhausted the administrative remedies. And we do now plan to move forward, and I plan to move forward with these groups in filing a lawsuit against the IRS to enforce the plain meaning of the law, and frankly, get the IRS out of the business of trying to draw these fine distinctions between whether something is 49% or 48% or whatever it may be political activity. The law says that if you're not exclusively a social welfare organization, you shouldn't be organizing under the 501c4 umbrella. And so that's what we plan to do. Now, the whole idea, as I said at the outset here, is to require disclosure to the public, to the voters, when groups are engaged in spending money to try and influence your vote. And it's based on a pretty simple principle that all of us voters have a right to know who is bankrolling these political campaigns. And as I said earlier, that principle was supported by 8 out of the 9 Supreme Court justices. And of course, that was the entire idea behind the Disclose Act. The Disclose Act we first introduced back in 2010. And the Disclose Act is pretty straightforward in concept. It requires all organizations that are spending money on political campaign expenditures to disclose the sources of their funding of those political expenditures to the voters, including 501c4s, but also other organizations that are engaged in spending money in that fashion. And that idea, that very simple and powerful idea of disclosure, used to be a bipartisan idea. In fact, Senator McConnell, who has now made it one of his purposes in political life to defeat the Disclose Act, took a very different position with respect to disclosure back in 2000. And I would just read from what he said on Meet the Press back in the year 2000. I don't know if anyone has read this today, but it should be required reading for everybody who is part of this debate. Because here's what he said, and this was at a time when Senator McConnell was opposing the McCain-Feingold legislation that established 527s, and of course 527s are required to disclose. And here's what he said, Senator McConnell, quote, "Republicans are in favor of disclosure. If you're going to do that, and the Senate voted to do that, and I'm prepared to go down that road, then it needs to be meaningful disclosure. Tim, referring to the late Tim Russert, 527s are just a handful of groups. We need to have real disclosure. And so what we ought to do is broaden the disclosure to include at least labor unions and tax-exempt business associations and trial lawyers, and so you include all the major political players in America. And he ended his statement saying, why would a little disclosure be better than a lot of disclosure? Well, I agree with Senator McConnell in the year 2000. Why would a little disclosure be better than a lot of disclosure? As you know, we require 527s to disclose. We should require, for the good of our democracy, as 8 out of 9 Supreme Court justices said, we should require groups that are trying to influence your vote in these political campaigns to tell us who's bankrolling their operations. And we need to continue to push forward to get that done. Now, as I said, we first introduced the disclose in the year 2010. It passed the House back then, and the Senate version of the Disclose Act, at that time introduced by Senator Schumer and others, actually had a vote in the Senate, but it was blocked. I shouldn't say it had a vote on procedural issues in the Senate. It was blocked at that time. 59 senators in favor, and of course the others opposed. So a strong majority in favor of the Disclose Act, but blocked on a filibuster because it fell one short of getting the 60 votes necessary to stop the filibuster and proceed to a final vote on the Senate Disclose Act. And in one of the sort of sad ironies of history, that 60th vote that would have been cast would have been Senator Kennedy. Senator Kennedy died earlier that year. Scott Brown voted against allowing the bill to come to a vote. He voted against cloture, so we never got the 60 that would have led to a final passage of the Senate Disclose bill. So here we are. We've reintroduced this Disclose bill in the House of Representatives. The original version was we had a Republican, Mike Castle, who was very much in favor of disclosure. By the way, his loss had nothing to do for his co-sponsoring the Disclose Act. He will tell you that. In the House, we have Walter Jones now, but this has, become, Senator McConnell and others have made this into a political issue. And so in the House, obviously, we have a majority party that's against the idea, at least for now, of requiring voters, requiring disclosure, letting voters know. And in the United States Senate, we are seeing some progress because Senator Murkowski has joined with Senator Wyden introducing a different version of Disclose, and there are a variety of issues with respect to that legislation, but the idea is disclosure. And of course, Sheldon Whitehouse is continuing to work on this issue in the Senate as well. So we need to continue to push to try and get that through, and I'll talk a little bit very briefly at the end about what I think we need to do to get people politically motivated here. So that's the state of play on disclosure writ large. But I think we all know that in the House, this measure is not moving anytime soon, unfortunately, the Disclose Act. And in the Senate, given Mitch McConnell's absolute opposition and transigence, it's hard to see in the short term how we get a vote that would get beyond, that would get cloture, even if we had a majority, which I think we'd have a majority vote in the Senate on Disclose today, but Mitch McConnell would clearly block any effort to get it to a final vote. So as we sort of, marshal the effort to pass that in the coming years, what can we do in the meantime? Well, there are lots of things we can do. We need to focus on pieces of this puzzle and sort of try and address it from every angle. So all of us, I think, know, you may have spoken earlier about the fact that the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, is undertaking a rulemaking The Supreme Court in Citizens United was really clear. I mean, they specifically mentioned the benefit in our system of informing shareholders about when a company's getting involved in political campaigns. They couldn't have been clearer. Here's what Justice Scalia and Justice Alito and others had to say, and I quote, "With the advent of the internet, prompt disclosure of expenditures can provide shareholders and citizens with the information needed to hold corporations and elected officials accountable for their positions and supporters. Shareholders can determine whether their corporation's political speech advances the corporation's interest in making profits, and citizens can see whether their elected officials are, quote, in the pocket, unquote, of so-called money interests." So again, that's 8 of the 9 justices in Citizens United. So we need to pursue this before the SEC, and they're obviously in the process of taking a look at it, and we need to pursue it in the courts. Now, as was said earlier, one of the measures working its way through the courts is a lawsuit that we filed, that I filed a number of years ago now. What is it now, Karen? And it's Van Hollen versus FEC. It's based on the same idea that the IRS lawsuit would be based on, which is that the statute is pretty clear on its face, and that the regulations, in this case that were promulgated by the FEC, as opposed to the IRS, that the regulations promulgated by the FEC illegally narrowed the scope of the plain language of the statute. This particular case relates to whether or not an entity has to disclose a contribution made to it when that entity is then engaged in spending money to try and influence the election of a candidate, a political campaign. And the way the FEC narrowed the statute was to say that if you gave money to one of these entities, a 501c4, it only had to be disclosed if you gave it that money with the specific intent and purpose of it being used to run a political expenditure ad. So if the organization, took that money and spent it for a political campaign ad, unless you specifically told them that was your purpose, the entity wouldn't have to disclose, which clearly deviated from the clear purpose of the law, which had no test of purpose in giving. So the same kind of idea where you had an agency, applying an interpretation of the law that had no basis in the statute itself. That case is right now on remand. We won at the district court level. It was reversed in part. It was reversed at the circuit court level, back before the court, and we expect a decision out of that court sometime later this summer or fall in that particular case. So whether it's the FEC or the IRS or the SEC, it's important that we continue to press the very simple principle of disclosure and why that's important to our democratic process. Now, my focus today has obviously been on disclosure, both in terms of targeted efforts as well as a broader effort. Disclosure is, of course, just one part of a very broad effort to try and make sure that big money doesn't totally dominate our political system. In the House and the Democratic caucus, Leader Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi, has put together a sort of umbrella effort called DARE. Stands for D for disclosure, A is for amend, looking at constitutional amendments, R is for reform, campaign finance reform, and there are a number of very important efforts in that effort. Senator Sarbanes, Congressman Sarbanes, Congressman Price, and others of us have been working on that piece. E in the DARE stands for empowerment, which is just trying to make sure voters have access to the polls. And we had there was a victory yesterday in the Supreme Court decision in the Arizona case, prohibiting states from piling on with their own requirements layering on top of the federal requirements in efforts to try and limit access to the ballot box. So that was an important victory. So the E in DARE, the empowerment, are a whole slew of measures to try and make sure people have access to the ballot box, including things like not having to stand in line, right, for 5, 6, 7 hours. All important parts of making sure that our democracy works. So that's sort of that's the sort of agenda writ large. And let me just close by saying our challenge, and I think all of you know this, is to really get voters to engage on this issue, right? I mean, this has to become more of a part of campaigns around the country. And it's not an issue that's, you know, people need to look at in isolation. I think everybody who's been involved in this effort recognizes that the issues we're talking about here today, whether it's disclose, whether it's campaign finance reform, whether it's trying to improve access to the ballot box, is all part of an effort to make sure that people have an equal voice in the process. And that when you don't do that, you get legislation, in many cases, that is tilted in favor of those people who decide to invest a lot of money in trying to shape legislation, and they try and shape it through lobbying efforts, and obviously there are groups on all sides of every issue, and they try and shape it at the ballot box in terms of you know, the money put into campaigns and to include, obviously, independent expenditures. And so in order to really engage the public, we need to connect the dots on all these issues. We need to continue to paint a picture of how a broken campaign finance system and a system that is fueled largely by secret money does not serve, in many cases, the broad interests of the American public, that it serves disproportionately the interests of you know, folks who are spending a lot of money to try and influence the process. And only by connecting those dots on whatever issue you want to talk about, I think are we going to be able to really engage the voters and show that this is a fundamental issue and that it's fundamental to a democracy that works for everybody. So I know sometimes it's easy to get discouraged because it has been so difficult making progress in these areas, but I just encourage you to not give up because I know, and I'll end with this, when you actually put this question to the public, the forces of transparency and accountability and trying to make sure that we empower, you know, people based on their capacity to vote, not on their capacity to contribute and spend lots of money, we win. I mean, overwhelming majorities of the American people, Democrats, Republicans, independents, support the idea of disclosure. They support the notions behind campaign finance reform. So if you could ever get an election to be about that issue, then the candidates supporting that issue will win. The challenge, of course, is when so many things are going on in people's lives with the economy, with you know, education, with healthcare, is to link those issues that are front and center in their minds up with the issue of campaign finance reform and disclose. That fusion has to take place in the mind of voters in order for us to succeed in this effort. And nobody knows these issues better than the people gathered here in this room. So we're counting on all of you to help spread the word so that we can have a better system and a system that truly works for everybody based on one person, one vote, as opposed to the amount of money being spent in a campaign. Thank you very much for all that you do, and I'd be happy to try and answer your questions. So, thank you. And I do want to thank the Brennan Center and others for filing an amicus in the case, in the FEC case.
Well, thank you, Representative Van Hollen. If you have time maybe for one or two questions, sure. That'd be great. Sir, do you have a question?
Hi, I'm Robert McGuire from the Center for Responsive Politics. I work on our project to document 990s and create a data set that the IRS doesn't produce. And I want to ask you something that has to do with in lieu of disclosure, in lieu of big changes. One of the things that struck me is just how ridiculous certain systems are that should be easily changed. Just to give you one example, the IRS doesn't have a searchable database of 990s. You have to fill out a piece of paper, fax or mail it to the IRS, wait 60 days to receive a hard copy in the mail, or if you want large sets, you have to pay thousands of dollars to receive DVDs in the mail of 990s. This doesn't include 1024s and other things like that. And I could go on and on and on about things that just don't make sense, that don't have to do with the big issue of disclosure. They just help the public get the documents that are under Section 6104 public documents. And so I want to ask you, is anyone talking about that, about the little things that could change in these critical areas where, you know, the public is trying to get information that it rightly deserves?
Right. So we should be. I mean, that's not a particular issue that I was familiar with until you just mentioned that in terms of the difficulty of getting it. So I think the answer is that we look forward to working with people to try and, you know, make the existing system work better with respect to its intended purposes, as you just indicated. I still think that when it comes to the IRS and having to make these determinations that I talked with, it would be better if we had that bright line test that is set out in the statute, which with respect to the exclusive, 501c4 organizations are supposed to engage exclusively in social welfare activity. I mean, you still have to decide what is political activity versus social welfare activity, but once you've made that determination, you don't have to try and figure out whether that organization is spending, just under 50% or not on those kind of activities. But any ideas anybody has in terms of how to improve the existing process, because obviously what happened at the IRS was very broken and very wrong.
Do you have time for one more question?
Sure. Yeah.
Ma'am.
Hey, Margaret.
A segment of the population that doesn't seem to be much interested in reform is a segment of the population that's very concerned about foreign influence in this country. Is there any legitimate question to be raised about foreign money that we are not able to trace at the present time?
I think, Margaret, that's a really important point. And in fact, the Supreme Court made that point in their opinion. When they wrote about disclosure in their opinion, one of the points they made is that's a way to see whether we're complying with the prohibition against foreign contributions and foreign intervention in political campaigns. So the answer is yes. I mean, if something is secret, then it's much harder to know whether it's in violation of one of those other laws. Now, the Disclose Act, the original version of the Disclose Act that we introduced and which passed the House had a very important provision that related to exactly what you're talking about. The most recent version, we actually, while we thought that was an important component, we decided to take away some of the opposition by focusing it specifically just on disclosure, whereas the earlier version actually had more language regarding prohibitions on subsidiaries and things like that. But the provision as it relates to disclosure should do exactly what you say. And I think to the extent a lot of the opposition, and that might resonate with some of the opposition, the notion that you could have those kind of contributions that would be undisclosed. Yeah, it's a good point. Any other questions? Yeah.
Paul, why don't you have one last question?
Yeah.
Paul Blumenthal, Huffington Post. This has to do with the R from the DARE task force. Earlier this year, the Huffington Post released a memo from the DCCC that said that It was asking for freshman members of Congress to spend 4 hours a day doing call time, raising money from, big dollar donors. I was wondering what you think of that as a former head of the DCCC, whether you asked members of Congress to spend that much time fundraising, and what you think of the amount of time that members of Congress spend fundraising nowadays.
Well, I haven't seen that particular memo, but the issue you raise is exactly why we need campaign finance reform and disclose. I mean, it's Exhibit A of why we need to change the system. And the Supreme Court decision, unfortunately, Citizens United, has, made it all that much worse, right? Because now, in addition to raising money against a political opponent who has a political campaign, who raises money in conformity with limits and has to disclose, people have to worry about, an outside entity that can come from a different state that at the last minute spends millions of dollars of secret money trying to defeat a candidate, which just means that people have to spend more time worrying about it, because you can have some, corporation or whatever it may be, 501c4, if they're in compliance, if they're spending 49% of their money on political activities or less, they can just, pop up and do that. So, your question really goes to the heart of why we need campaign finance reform and disclosure and all these things we're talking about today. All right, thank you all very much for what you're doing.